that I still keep my playground up in DeRidder from when I worked out of town a few years ago. I have 10 acres up there and I have a trailer. So needless to say, when I saw the reports earlier in the week, I got a little bit concerned. I reached out to the preacher up there at DeRidder that I got to know very well in the 2 years that I worked out there. And he said, fortunately, no one in the congregation in DeRidder lives down in the Singer and Maryville area that it's affected by the fire. So that's a fantastic blessing. For as far as I'm concerned, it's a lot of it, but mine is just stuff. My neighbors, however, it's everything. That's their homes. So fortunately, thank God, the fire, I didn't double check this morning, but up till yesterday afternoon, the last time I checked, it's moving northwest, which puts it moving north and away from where my property is and where my neighbors are, and also away from DeRidder itself. It is, however, going towards Singer, if I remember right. No, Maryville. Anyway, one of the towns, last I saw was still in line. And again, the last I saw said it was about 50% contained, but that was early yesterday. With the rains that came through, hopefully they've been able to get a little bit better of an upper hand. So Scott, if you'll please keep those people in mind over there as well. Is there anybody else we need to put on the prayer list? Tom is having his second eye cataract surgery. I talked to him this morning about that. And of course, on the flip side, the Doddles have a brand new grandchild. You've got to look a little more proud, Edward. Thank you. Normally, I'll go back when I prepare for the following week, I'll go back and I'll look at what we did the previous week. And I noticed that I glossed over something in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 11. For anybody that doesn't know, we're in chapter 11 of Isaiah. And so I wanted to go back and touch bases on verses 2 and 3. We got into the belt and the full armor of God, so we're not going to rehash that. But again, I do want to go back to 2 and 3 real quick. 11 verse 2. Okay. Jacked, but first time I've had feedback like that. I'm not sure if that's a declaration for me to continue or a warning for me not to. Okay, 11:2. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and strength, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord, and he will not judge by what his eyes see, nor make a decision by what his ears hear. Who's Isaiah referring to? Remember, Isaiah is probably 90% prophecy. To whom is he prophesying? To Christ, yeah. Go over to Matthew 3:16. Don't lose your place in Isaiah, but go to Matthew 3:16 and 17. Okay. Matthew 3:16 and 17. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. Suddenly the heavens were opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and resting upon him. And a voice from the heaven said, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased." Look at that direct, almost identical language. And the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, and then we have the recounting of, in the Gospels, of that exactly happening. And so I just want to take a second and point that out. This is prophecy, and it was fulfilled directly. It's pretty obvious and pretty self-explanatory, so I don't think we need to belabor it. Okay, so again, we talked about the full armor of God and the belt and the girding. So let's drop down to verses 8 and 9. Because I think to me, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's that much of one. So starting with verse 8. And the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand in the viper's den. They will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, for the earth will be full of knowledge of the Lord, and the waters cover the sea. Directly, what mountain is Isaiah referring? We see it a lot in Isaiah, and we see it a lot referred to in the Old Testament. What was known as the mountain to the Jews? Mount Sinai, yeah. And I don't think there's any question that Isaiah is directly referring to Mount Sinai. But the way my mind works, something else kicked up to me as I got looking at this. Go to Matthew 16, verses 17 through 19. This is a very familiar verse to all of us, but I want to look at it in a slightly different light. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Back to the Greek. What does Peter mean? A rock, a small rock. And as that verse continues, and upon this rock, who remembers what that Greek interpretation was? It was a shelf. It was big. I don't think it's that far of a stretch to put these two verses together. Because if Isaiah is prophesying Christ, and he talks about the mount will not be destroyed, they will not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain, I don't think it's that far of a stretch to put these two together. That Isaiah was prophesying, whether directly or indirectly, about Christ building his church upon that rock, that foundation. How else do we see Christ referred in this context? In the context of building, how do we see Christ referred? as a rock, as a cornerstone, yeah. So see, all of these thoughts tie together here. So now I want to take this passage one step further. Let's go to Acts 28:3 for the other side of this passage. This, again, is probably a very familiar passage. Acts 28:3. Paul gathered a bundle of sticks, and he laid them on the fire. A viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself to his hand. When the islanders saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "Surely this man is a murderer. Although he was saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The islanders were expecting him to swell up or suddenly drop dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now, obviously, they weren't correct that Paul was not a god. But see the correlation here with what Isaiah is talking about? And the nursing child will play by the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child will put his hand in the viper's den. They will not hurt. Okay? So there's correlations here. Again, I don't think Isaiah was doing direct prophecy to this, but I think we see these actions happen, and it's not hard to construe that. Now, don't misunderstand me. I do not think that we can stick our hands into a bed of vipers and get bit and not suffer ill effects. Don't anybody even begin to infer that in what I'm saying. Paul was able to do that because he was an apostle and he had special gifts. But again, I think that these things, we look at them as isolated incidents, but we can go back and we can see their roots in prophecy from Isaiah. That's what I wanted to drive home about this. We go through this is so rich. And if we take the time, we can see how the New Testament comes back and fulfills all of this, or everything that was in this prophecy gets fulfilled. Any questions or comments? Okay. No. Excellent point. He did not do it on purpose. Yeah. He did not flaunt the gifts that God gave him. Yeah. Yeah. What do you think the purpose of both the references in Isaiah and the direct actions in the New Testament in Acts have in common? What do you think their purpose is? Don't they reflect the power of God? And just like we've saw all through Joshua and we've seen through constantly, God is letting everyone know that he is in control, that this is his and we are his. That's what I get out of it anyway. No. Yeah. Yeah.
So a combination of two things at work here. One, the foreknowledge of God and the dwelling of his spirit that reveals to man that which God wants man to know, which is the truth. And the second thing is the fulfillment of prophecy.
Yeah. That, to me, is a very important thing that's being pulled from Isaiah, is the fulfillment of that prophecy. And we're going to touch bases on that in a little bit. And I have to confess that until I was challenged with this study and with the study of Joshua, I never appreciated how much is directly fulfilled in what we study day to day in the New Testament. So don't be afraid of going back and reading the Old Testament and finding the roots of all of these things that we profess to believe, because that's where they are. do 10 through, I think 10 through 12. Then it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people who will remain from Assyria, Egypt, Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he will lift up a standard for the nations, and will assemble the banished ones of Israel, and will gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. I don't want to miss how much is in here. We're going to take some time, and we're going to burn into this one. What day comes to mind to you that Isaiah is referring in this passage? Take a look again at verse 10 and verse 11. Okay, let's start. Let's back up a little bit. Let's start on the easy stuff. Who again is being referred here? Christ. No question. No question. Where is his resting place? Where is Christ's resting place? In heaven. What's one word that is so often used about heaven? Glorious. Okay. Then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand. Okay, I don't want to miss this passage here. This is what came to my mind. I want you to think in terms of the crucifixion. What are some, not up to, after Christ forgave the thief that hung next to him, what are some of the sequences of events that happened after that? Not that far after. Immediately. I'm sorry? The veil was torn. Which direction? Top to bottom. Was that by accident? Top to bottom, what did that indicate? It did it? Yes. It provided access to God. But the physical top to bottom, what did that indicate? Yeah. Top to bottom is that God was the one responsible for that. That was a very, very tall veil. So to have it come from top to bottom, it was clear that it was God tearing that veil. And that happened when? When Jesus died. Okay. I don't want to miss that. Put that together with this. He will recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people. Isaiah is talking about the time at which the Old Testament ceases and the New Testament will begin. Now, we know that the church began on the day of Pentecost, but this was the point at which God was going to open up his access to all. Because prior to that, how did they have access to God, and who had access to God? Speak up, please, I'm deaf. Okay, let's start. Who had access to God? The high priest once a year. Did the Sumerians have access to God? No. Did the Egyptians have access to God? Who had access to God? The Jews, through the high priest who went into the Holy of Holies once a year. When that veil was torn and God claimed his entire remnant from all of these places that he labels, who now has access? Everyone. Everyone has access to God through Christ. I don't want to miss that beauty that's in here in Isaiah's prophecy. Okay. Any other comments, questions?
That was all, no doubt, because of God's foreknowledge, all in God's plan to essentially take the gospel message to all corners of the earth, not just through the apostles, but through all of those who were in Jerusalem, many of whom obeyed the gospel on or shortly thereafter the day of Pentecost, recognizing that they would be dispersed when the persecution started, which was another plan of God, knowing in foreknowledge what would happen, and the fact that the Romans would cause a dispersal because of the uprising in Jerusalem, and all of those who were now members of the body of Christ, the church, not just Jews, but
That's right.
body of Christ now, dispersed back to their homeland, taking with them the knowledge of salvation.
Yep, exactly. What I thought was interesting is when I looked at this verse and I got doing some digging, I looked at Clark, because I have the hard copy, so I use Clark a lot for reference. And I've mentioned before that I appreciate Clark when he interprets Greek and Hebrew, and I appreciate him very much when he interprets history. But I always look at him as a jaded eye when it comes to actual interpretation of the word, because he misses the point sometimes, as we all do. It was interesting that Clark, in verse 11, contended that that prophecy had yet to be accomplished. How do we know Clark was wrong? That's an important question for us to be thinking of. How do we know that the assertion that that prophecy has yet to be fulfilled is wrong? See, that's what Clark implies. Clark implies that this refers to the second coming. I would contend Clark is wrong. And I want to start with Matthew 5, 17 through 20. Matthew 5, 17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And that's a key part of that phrase. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven. These are the words of Jesus. What is he talking about specifically? That's right. That's right. When Christ fed the thousands, what was one of the battles that he fought at that moment? What did they want to do with Christ? They wanted to make him king, okay, earthly king. And then, hey, this man can turn a few fish into feeding 5,000. He can take care of the Romans with no trouble. Okay. So that was one of the battles that Christ fought right then. The context of this is that he's going, all of what Moses handed down is in effect until all is accomplished. And again, that's the key part of this phrase here. But Christ is talking and reminding those that are around him that they are subject to the law of Moses. And they are subject to every jot and tittle of the law of Moses. And Jesus upheld every jot and tittle of the law of Moses, didn't he? Yeah. Nod your heads up and down. Go, yeah. Okay. All right, so that's the basis for where Jesus was coming from. Okay, now, what were the last words that Jesus spoke? It is finished. At least that's almost every scholar agrees that those were the actual last words, because you have to go through all four Gospels from what I studied. You have to go through all four Gospels and put the context of all four together to find out everything that is recorded that Jesus said. But I wanted to pull something out of here. What does it mean, it is finished? Because I want to follow the context of where I'm going with this. I'm sorry? Yeah. That's what we know it to mean. We understand it to mean. It is finished is the English translation of the Greek word tetelestai, which was the last thing Jesus said before dying on the cross. Tetelestai comes from the verb teleo, which means to bring to an end, to complete, to accomplish. It's a crucial word because it signifies the end to a particular course of action. It's the word you would use when you climb to the peak of Mount Everest. It's the word you would turn to in the final copy of your dissertation. It's the word you would use when you make the final payment on your new car, et cetera, et cetera. So the actual language that Jesus used supports our belief and our assertion that Christ fulfilled all the law when he said it is finished by the very choice of his words. So it supports what we believe. We can prove what we believe. Sometimes we're, including me, we're too lazy to do it, but we can prove it with study and with a little research and with a little digging and finding these things out. Okay, let's complete that thought process. Go to Hebrews 1:1. Again, a passage that should be very familiar to everyone. God, who at various times, in various ways, spoke in time past to the fathers by the prophets, Isaiah being one of them, has in these last days spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also made the worlds, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power, when he had said by himself, purged our sins, sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become so much better than the angels, as he has by inheritance obtained a more excellent name than they. So you see this progression of thought here, how it comes right back and it completes Isaiah's prophecy. And it's not just an assertion we make by saying, well, Christ fulfilled all prophecy. We have it here laid out in the scriptures for us. Okay, so we talked, let's go to Luke 23. And we're going to get back to what we talked about with the veil. Okay, so we've talked about the veil being torn from top to bottom, and you'll find that in Luke 23. And let's pick up right where it's at. It should be starting somewhere around verse 26. Let's see. No, it starts a little farther. Okay. Thank you. Let's start at 44. And now the 6th hour, the darkness fell over the whole land until the 9th hour, the sun being obscured, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. Now when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, Certainly this man was innocent. And all the multitudes who came together for this spectacle, when they observed what had happened, began to return, beating their breasts. And all his acquaintances and all the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance, seeing these things. Again, let's think in terms of Jewish culture. Beating their breasts. What do you think that implied? Guilt. Absolutely. Guilt and shame. And deeper than that, an understanding of what had just happened. And I don't think we should ever sell the Jews short. They understood whether they did what they should have done, but they knew. And again, it becomes an object lesson for us. We understand. The question is, do we do it? So they recognized all of these things that had been written by the prophets, or a lot of them did. Let me put it that way. A lot of the Jews understood that because they had heard these things all their life. They had had the recounts of Moses and Joshua and all of the prophets, especially Isaiah, all through their lives. And there it was played out in front of them. And I think it was crystal clear to those that had paid attention as they grew up exactly what happened. And that's why they were beating their breasts. Barnes, the commentator Barnes, on his notes on the Bible, the things which were done, the earthquake, the darkness, the sufferings of Jesus, smote their breasts in token of alarm, fear, and anguish. They saw the judgments of God. They saw the guilt of the rulers, and they feared the further displeasure of the Almighty. That came from Barnes. Any other comments in here? Okay. 13 and 14 refer to listings of peoples and furthering this thought of them conflicting with each other. So I want to go down to 15. And the Lord will utterly destroy the tongue of the sea of Egypt, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind, and he will strike it into 7 streams and make men walk over dry shod. And there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who will be left, just as there was for Israel in the day that they came up out of the land of Egypt. Okay, here Isaiah has got 2 different things going on, in my opinion. Metaphorically, he's talking about the development of the church and how the church will spread. This smoting was brought up about the dispersion when the Romans started to crack down, when they felt that the church was getting a little too powerful. Okay. Directly, look at this and tell me what thoughts come to mind that would have made sense to the Jews that Isaiah was prophesying to at the time. And I don't think we ever want to lose the context, the original context of what the prophet was trying to teach. The Sea of Egypt, his hand over the river, men walk over dry shod. What pictures that bring back to you? Crossing of the Red Sea. In fact, the commentators even say that this was an allusion to that. And let's go back to Exodus 14:21, because I had never paid that close attention to this to see the language that's actually in this. Again, this is a child story that we learn that God parted the Red Sea and the Jews walked through it, and the Egyptians came behind him and he closed down on top of the Egyptian army. But Exodus 14:21, Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the Lord caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind that all night, and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. Isaiah 11:15, and he will wave his hand over the river with his scorching wind. You see the direct allusion here to what Isaiah is referring? What was Isaiah's message here? Generalized message. It was one of hope, wasn't it? That God would not forget his remnant. That's the overlying theme of what Isaiah is talking about in here. And if we just pass it over that way, we miss so much of the rest of this. Isaiah is reminding the Jews that God does have the power to save his remnant and will save his remnant. Yeah. How did the Jews teach their children? They send them off to Broadmoor 5 days a week? Every night, they would recount their history, and they would recount the passing of through the Red Sea. They would recount all of these things. They would recount Joshua's victories. They probably didn't recount a whole lot of the defeats or of their failures, but nonetheless, they would recount all of these things. So yeah, they knew exactly what Isaiah was talking about. Any last comments about chapter 11? That's kind of why I kind of delayed. I didn't want to start chapter 12. That's how John the Baptist was able to gain the following that he did, because the Jews understood that, because they knew Isaiah, and that's how Christ was able to follow through with that. I mean, these actions in and of themselves would have been really strange to the Egyptians or the Assyrians, but they were not actions that were strange to the Jews, were they? They were prophesied for hundreds of years. Now, understandably so, And the more that I dig into this, the more I understand why the Jews thought it was a physical kingdom. Now, that doesn't excuse them for not listening to Christ when Christ talked and told them it was so much more, and the apostles followed up with it so much more. But when you get into Isaiah and he talks about the remnant, constantly talking about the remnant, it's understandable why the Jews originally thought that it would be a physical kingdom. So yeah, I don't like to cut them a lot of slack because I think they should have known a lot more, or they did know a lot more than they wanted to, but by the same token, they were taught these things for hundreds and hundreds of years. So. Any last comments? Todd, how's Kelly doing? Good. 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 Would you close?